This is another webinar in the series that we've been running around looking at your financial systems and potentially what shortfalls or areas that they're not telling you about. Once again, happy to be joined by my two panelists, starting with Troy Nicholson, one of the founders of Satori, also our director in charge of business development, and also Natalia Levenkova, who's our GM for customer success. Lots of experience in this particular space and across many customers and a number of sort of good war stories to share with you today. So yeah, let's kick off into it. So first of all, before I get into the detail, just to let you know that we are running live, and we would certainly welcome questions through this through today's proceedings. So to those of you familiar with Zoom, there's a Q&A button that you should see on your panel. You can click into that at any time and feel free to add any questions. We'll certainly make an effort to look at them at the end of the session. We've got plenty of time for that. But if anything comes up that is pertinent to the discussion, we can pick on it at the time. So please make use of that, and we would love to take questions from you. All right, so let's get started. Why are we looking at expense management systems? I suppose like many of the financial systems that we organizations depend on, they're really useful, of course, they're very powerful. They become an absolute necessary in terms of managing the process of corporate expenses, whether it's corporate cards or claims coming in. But what we find, and certainly through our experience, is that they don't necessarily provide you with the ongoing protection and the assurance from an independent point of view that you would be guarded against things like errors and oversights, policies and control breaches. We'll spend quite a bit of time today talking about our credit card policies and how not enough is being done to understand how well we are complying with those. Any of control failures, and of course, ultimately fraud, which is where a lot of this can land. Furthermore, policy changes. If you're introducing changes to your policy and you're trying to determine the effectiveness of those and whether they are being followed, a lot of these systems don't really provide you with that kind of intelligence, which is, of course, really important. So why are we focusing on corporate cards today as opposed to other business areas? Well, the research has shown us that corporate card spend has really grown significantly and continues to grow. The research we've been able to access shows that it's growing at about a 10% compounded annual growth rate of 10% over the past 15 years, which is really significant. And what's accounting for that is, first of all, cost savings. There's certain categories of procurement that really do well through corporate cards, and those are being driven more and more down to that level. When organizations look to empower some business functions or particular projects or teams maybe working remotely, it is a very good way to make sure that they're in charge and able to execute on their own procurement where possible. For small purchases, it's certainly much more rapid and more cost effective. And that allows procurement to focus on strategic sourcing and adding value to the business rather than getting clogged up in smaller purchases. However, with any of these kind of moves, whilst it has a lot of benefits, it comes at costs, and it does require some additional scrutiny and monitoring. So it's probably no surprise that we've seen stories such as these come up in the press. The one on the left, in fact, only came up this week. Some of you may have seen it, and it really had to do with the fact that in the public service, a bit of investigation into domestic flights being used in the public service were way overindulged into business class, personal trips and the like, and most of it was on corporate cards, which were not being scrutinized enough. Of course, a lot of it happens that we find about it in the public sector because they do disclose these things. Our experience in Satori, having worked with both public and private sector, is that this kind of this happens really across all industries, and it's not really it's not peculiar to public sector at all. Just as prevalent in the private sector, but maybe less public. So, Natalia, let me maybe start with you. Give us some of your expertise. I know this is a big area to start to tackle. Where would you typically start with this?
Normally, we recommend our customers to start with the credit card travel and expense policy. We recommend using analytics to enforce the policy by making sure that people are aware that you're monitoring what they're doing, monitoring their spend, and also reminding people to follow the rules. So whenever you pick up any issues, you can remind people that you have to be aware about policy and stick with the rules. So it might be something very, very simple, like making sure that people stick to the spend limits on meals, they're using preferred merchants, they're submitting their expense reports on time, and so forth. One of the examples from our experience, one of our customers had a problem with credit card holders not submitting the expense reports on time, like they haven't been submitting it for months, which incurred significant late payment fees for the company to be paid.
Right. And I think analytics obviously really important in this part and can help us with policy compliance, particularly with corporate card. But what else would you think it could help with?
Yeah, I would split it probably into a few broad categories. One good approach could be to look at something what you potentially want to be in your policy, or you might want to explore some risky areas and see if there are issues happening there. So, for example, you might test for specific scenarios to see if there are repeat offenders or those are isolated incidents. And you potentially might update the policy by including a clause on the repeat offenders, saying that, for example, we suspend credit cards after 2 or 3 occurrences of inappropriate spend. Another broad category would be data integrity issues. It is as important as in any other area. I know it sounds very boring, but that's something what would help you in the future. So if you get rid of dormant credit cards, if you get rid of multiple credit cards for the same person if it's not required, missing or incomplete information, for example, very often we don't see sufficient information on the description or justification of expenses. All these things can help to reduce the number of other issues around credit cards or expenses. And also another area might be more complicated is to look for potential red flags, which are not it's not enforced by your policy, and that might not be aligned on the surface, but it can help you to identify potential suspicious activity happening. For example, it might be spent with unusual merchants, so they're not prohibited, but it's just not something what you would expect to see on your business credit card, or maybe suspicious keywords.
Right. Any other, I know suspicious activity is something we spend a lot of time looking at and trying to identify. Any other tests that you can think of in that area?
Yeah, so that this area is quite tricky. So you need to look out for multiple things. For example, we had a case with one of our customers where they were aware that something dodgy is happening with the spend on staff picnics or events or team building activities. So they start, and it's very difficult to identify unless you look at the actual attached receipt to see what they spent on. So they started looking for a number of things like specific merchant names, suspiciously high amount of the spend for the number of people indicated on the expense, and a few other things. So it's like a combination of things, and they discovered that people were spending on, say, staff picnic, but they also were buying things such as alcohol, cigarettes, or dog food, something what you do not expect to see there.
I'm sure it gets quite interesting.
maybe a couple of other examples I wanted to mention. Manager approval process, that's another way people heavily rely on this process to pick up red flags, because managers are supposed to review all the expenses. So it's worth monitoring the approval process as well. So you can look for things like, and some of that again can be in your policy, that for example, you're not supposed to approve your own expenses, or you cannot approve it straight after the expense was lodged. You really need to take your time to review that, open up the attachments before you approve that. So things like that. And just as a general remark, that in other types of analytics we can do is to look at general spend on credit cards, to like at bigger trends, to see maybe, as you mentioned, that lots of things processed for credit cards to allow for business flexibility. But at the same time, sometimes if you're buying something on credit cards with merchants which you have a special deal with, you might be missing out on those better deals.
Through your procurement process.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Troy, maybe I can hand over to you. I mean, I know a big area for us is dashboards, and I know that when we go to a lot of our clients, organizations that we chat to, they're relying a lot on kind of dashboarding activity to come out of corporate card spend. And I know you've sort of provided quite a bit of thinking around that area, and what's, how those things are failing organizations and not telling them enough about how well it functions.
I'll put a couple of slides together.
Yeah, go for it.
Just in case. So constantly out there in the market, I see
Sorry, let me run to you.
Sorry, slight technical problem. Sorry.
Okay.
So quite often out there in the market, we see organisations trying to solve the monitoring of corporate cards with reports. So typically their expense management system doesn't give them the reports they require out of the box. So they're using spreadsheets, or quite often they're implementing dashboards. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about dashboards and where the value of dashboards are, and maybe where there's some gaps. So before I start, just some very high level generic policies that you'd see in most corporate card policies. So as Natalia just mentioned, unauthorized vendors, it could not only be a reputational risk to the organisation of using a particular supplier, but it could be also missing out on discounts or rebates if you're not buying through a central portal and you're buying things like travel or stationery through Officeworks when you've got a corporate deal with say a Wink or a flight centre. Most of our customers prohibit totally personal expenditure. However, maybe all of us, we see lots of examples out there where there's actually just a human error. So classic one is the Uber these days, Uber rideshare apps, where you jump in an Uber on a Saturday night, you travel and you just pay for the trip, and you realise you haven't switched the card over. So the trip's actually been charged to the corporate card. So making sure that people are spending within their delegation limits. So it's another one and we see rorting of that sometimes, whether it's a fraud or whether it's abuse or whether it's just solving a business problem. It's things like split transactions. So what do I see? Two different transactions for the same vendor on the same day that go above a particular person's role. And another one that's we see out there is that if you're spending with a particular supplier, you should be going through the procurement process, which means that you raise a requisition, it gets approved, and it goes through the ERP system. However, when we look at the data on corporate cards, we see cardholders spending, $80, $90, $120,000 a year with a particular supplier. Sometimes it's, or most of the time, it's not knowing. It's just not being aware that in the last 12 months that spending is racked up. But it is a gap where there is a fraud risk there, or a conflict of interest or collusion risk to the organisation. For those of you who have to 3, even 5, 10, 15 direct reports. If you're approving expenses on a monthly basis, how do you remember? How do I know if Mark was on leave a particular Wednesday 2 weeks ago? What date that was? Does this expenditure match up? So it's very difficult to match the HR data to your expense system data. So you need to bring in products like dashboards or reports. And I'll explain a bit more about those in a moment. Thanks, Mark. So if I can just, this is a very typical trend, what we call trend dashboard that you'll see out there in the market. If I look at the top right portion, you'll see in that transactions by merchant. So that's essentially showing for that particular period, that's showing where I'm spending my money, the top 10 merchants, and no surprise, we're a company called Motion Ventures. It's one of our key suppliers, but guess what? They're spending more than the 80 grand. Well, this is a longer period, but they're spending a lot of money with us. Why are we spending that money on corporate cards? Why can't we be going through the proper procurement process? So also see a business there called Indian Trading. So that business there, they're getting very close to that $80,000 threshold. So if I'm a manager or executive, if I want to maintain monitoring of those cards, I've got to remember to log into the dashboard every month or every so often to then run that range, that 12-month range, to understand, has that threshold been breached? So you need to be quite proactive in these dashboards to get any assurance over the spend. If you look down at the square below that, it shows the top card holders. This is one I hear all the time, that we want to look at our top 10 or 15 card holder spend per period. This one's showing for this particular period, old Ezekiel Chu. Is no surprise there, because that particular person is actually in procurement. So that's plausible that that person will be spending a lot of money on a corporate card. But if I look down the page, I can see Penny, old Penny there, Penny Waite. Penny's actually in our one of our sales directors in the organisation. It's plausible that she would be spending that type of money. And however, by just looking at that there, I don't really have a oversight in terms of is Penny spending in the policy or not. I just know that she spent almost $70,000 over that period of time. It's got the transactions. With this nice dashboard, I can draw through, but then I've got to eyeball the data and go through that and try and understand, based on our policy, is Penny spending within the policy or not. So while trend dashboards provide some great insights in terms of where we can go and do group deals in terms of suppliers, where we need to bring spend into more procurement, a more rigid structure and process, it's not the only way to make sure you can get assurance. This particular example dashboard here is an exception-based dashboard. So what's happening in the background, there's a whole bunch of exception-based tests that have been running based on the policy, and they're running periodically, could be automatically or over every week or every month. And then if an alert has occurred, it's been sent to someone in the organisation for remediation. That particular person has taken that exception and provided a mini investigation, and next to that transaction, they've input to the system the issue, what the issue was, what action was taken, and what was the root cause. And now that information provides executives with a lot more meaningful insights in terms of, is the policy being adhered to? So if you look at on the right-hand side, right-hand pane there, we can see repeat offenders by business unit, and I can see logistics and no surprise sales, breaking potentially complete all the time breaching their policy. So maybe there's not fraudsters or abusers, but maybe there's a valid reason why. So there could be a genuine business reason why logistics have to continually break the policy. So we need to go back and understand, do we need to do something in our processes to, I've had one example with a customer a couple of years back where this type of breaches were happening, and we found out that there were salespeople providing rebates back to their customers because if they brought the customer on board, provided marketing dollars to you for signage, but then we'd pay you in 90 days. Customers were unhappy about that, so the sales rep would just say, "Look, swipe my card for the $8,000, and I'll speak to the sales manager about it." So there's a genuine, valid business reason why the threshold amount was being broken by the particular salesperson. Also, we can look down in terms of who our suppliers are. So again, looking for other, not only just abuse, but opportunity to then go to those suppliers and then create a corporate-wide deal. But the nice thing about that is the executives now have, I guess, an outcome they can then drill through on the policy breaches. So if you look at the left-hand side, we can see there was 112 policy breaches across the organisation for that particular period, and then I'll be able to drill through and understand who are the card holders, what was the issue, why did it happen, what was the root cause, and then I can decide whether we need to take action with that particular card holder or supplier. It's just a lot more insight than just the trend dashboard. So really, you know, everyone's asking, CEOs always asking, do I have assurance? You know, it's always top of mind. Corporate cards, something that's always a top of mind for the boards or audit committees, that there's been potential abuse, particularly now. Things are becoming a little more challenging in the economy. So really what we say is that absolutely, you need to have exception-based monitoring for your corporate cards. However, some really key important areas you need to consider is that you need to be able to provide what we call high probable exceptions to the business for remediation. So we hear lots of complaints from customers that we've done this before and it throws up a lot of false exceptions. So it doesn't work particularly well. And that's actually true. So you've got to pick the exceptions where you get almost a binary result and you're able to follow through, rather than look at things such as spend on weekends and public holidays, which does show, it doesn't really give you much meaningful information. It's just a lot of noise. So it's really important you do that. It's also really important that if you're going to have to spend the time to have an exception report, build one, a rule, there's no point having exceptions if nobody's following them up or looking at them. So it's really important that if you're running exception-based monitoring, each exception is being followed up. If the team's only got time to follow up 5 exceptions in 1 week, then rather filter your exceptions to show the most important 5 for that particular week that we should be following up as a business. And important to record issue, action and root cause to then build up into those dashboards I showed you previously that will provide the greater assurance and insights to executives, rather than just trend analysis dashboards, which just shows me top card holders and top category spend.
Right. Thanks, Roy. I mean, that's really useful, and I hope everybody listening to us today has been able to get an understanding of the fact that A, it's an important area, but B, there's still a lot of work to be done to understand whether we are enforcing our policies, where we are getting the right value out of this activity, you know, against the investment that's being made into making it happen. So yeah, I think we sort of come to the end of our particular discussion. Got a few minutes just to talk about some questions. I see a couple of popped in. Whilst we dealing with those, really encourage you to add more. We've still got a few minutes to discuss them. Natalia, maybe I'll take this particular question to you. Somebody's asked about, the question is, we have a lot of other systems which touch on credit card and corporate cards. What's your experience? What's our experience in having been able to utilize those as part of enforcing better policy compliance and better analytics?
Yes, Troy mentioned in his presentation that it's very often even on the policy that you're supposed to take into account when people are on leave, and that the credit card has to be activated after the termination and things like that. So, and many expense management systems do not have good integration, or have very limited integration or no integration with other systems. So we think that cross-system checks are crucial to support that. We normally bring in HR and leave data to monitor for spend while on leave or after termination. So that's very basic things. Also, our customers who can cross credit card and expense transactions and accounts payable transactions to, for example, identify potential double dipping when people purchasing two of the same item through the credit cards and the accounts payable. Also, it can be used to look at the compound spend across with the same companies across credit cards and accounts payable, because very often these things are hidden just because you have those transactions across two different systems. And on top of that, for more mature monitoring, you can also add third-party data sources. That might be something as geolocation of the expense in comparison to the location, to the expected location of the employee, might be a very good red flag. And also, we also look at this from the conflict of interest perspective, and we're looking at the directors of the companies, of our merchants, and we check if those directors are actually our employees who are using their credit cards to purchase from themselves.
Yes, conflict of interest is probably a whole other topic
Yes.
that we can explore, and I think we have in previous webinars, but yeah, a lot of useful information there. I see there's one more question. Maybe I'll get you, Troy, to take it. The question is, and I know we see a lot of this, so this is certainly indicative of what we see. We use Power BI to populate corporate card spending. How does the Satori solution help leverage it from here? I think just from an educational point of view, it's not necessarily about what we do, but what do we see? Things like Power BI, where do they fall, and what are they missing out on that we know can be helpful?
So really what we're all about is that monitoring the policy is being followed by matching that policy to some tests. So looking at certain tests, testing the data. If something falls outside of that, then it's reported. So exception based. So that's Satori's philosophy. But it's around the workflow of that exception and what happens to it then. So it's really about ensuring the loop is closed for follow-up. And then that information, so it's followed up. The person doing the investigation, it could be a card holder, it could be centralized compliance team, it could be a line manager. Why was this issue reported? What action was taken and what was the root cause? And then that's giving you a lot better assurance in terms of, is the policy being followed? So you see dashboards in that first example I showed today, very high level trend analysis. I'm not saying you can't do exception-based testing in products like Power BI. However, you have no idea if anyone's looking at those exceptions or they're following them up, or that typically, we all know we're busy, months seem to flow by. When's the last time you actually did log in and do a proper investigation in terms of the spend around corporate cards through Power BI?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that just occurs to me from a client that we dealt with recently is that where we've come to them also is to say, what we've seen out there, here's a couple of scenarios for you to think about. They may not even have been in the policy. I think Natalia mentioned that sometimes we're not necessarily testing for what's in the policy. We may be testing to look for other things, and we've been able to actually help them to look at other scenarios that maybe then should be brought into the policy. And so there's a lot of sort of corporate knowledge there that one can benefit from.
Typically, the dashboards are just sitting on top of the expense management product, so they're just getting that data, not bringing in HR data, as Natalia mentioned. They're not bringing in ERP data. It's just typically a representation, and they've got their place. I mean, they are really important for procurement purposes, but they're not very powerful for having assurance over the corporate card spend and reducing fraud. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's great. Look, we on the half hour almost. I see there's one more question. The standard question we get at every webinar, and I should have mentioned it. We are recording this, and we will make it available to you during the course of this week. And more than happy for you to share that with colleagues or anybody else in the industry that you feel would benefit from it. And we'd also love to get ideas from anybody on the call who feels that they would love us to explore other areas of business and where monitoring and better assurance could be achieved. There's a wealth of information that we can still discuss with you. So with that, thanks again, Troy. Thanks, Natalia. Thanks to all of you who joined us today. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.